Okay, so my name's Tom Whitwell, and this is the Music Thing modular workshop system. I feel very weird doing this because I feel like I'm sort of channeling Mylar melodies while I'm doing it. So I need to be doing jazz hands like this, but he's an expert, I'm not. So this is the Music Thing modular workshop system. Let me turn it on. This is an all-in-one system. The idea was to create something. So about 18 months ago, I was asked to run a retreat in Cornwall where a bunch of musicians would come together and do field recording, do graphic scores, and make music. And I was talking to Dion, who's the person who organised that, who's a lecturer at Falmouth at the art school there. And we were talking about what people would play at this event. We were saying, are people going to bring things? Are we going to lend them equipment? What are we going to do? And in that meeting, it was in a pub in Falmouth by the river. I found myself saying, well, it would be nice if everyone had the same thing. And it would be nice if we had a particular device that they could all use. So at that point, this was about a year before I'm talking now. I'm talking now in September 2024. So about August last year, I started thinking, what would a device like this be? What would a standalone Music Thing modular device be? Because in the past, I've only made individual modules. So I've made a Turing machine, I've made microphony, and I made one or two sort of standalone things like this MIDI controller, the ATEM-U. But I've never done something that a musician can take and play sort of by itself. Although I'll come on to say that's not really what I was aiming to do. So I started making notes and I started saying, well, what would this be like? What sort of device do I want to create? And some of those things were, I wanted something that would connect to the outside worlds. So if you look on here, there's a few things that do that. We've got a stereo input here. I can plug in like a drum machine or my laptop or anything into that. And you get two modular level kind of left and right signals out there. Then down here, you've got a stomp box interface, kind of guitar pedal interface. You run in and out there and then send and return here. And you can blend it in, but you can also feedback it. So if you've got a guitar pedal like a delay or something, this will affect the feedback. But it also works with other things. If you've got, I've got a graphic EQ pedal, and in that, if you turn the feedback up, it starts to resonate, it starts to overdrive, it starts to oscillate. I was talking to someone the other day. Essentially, it turns anything into an oscillator. Then I'll come back to the computer later on. The computer is another way that this can talk to the outside world. But the idea was that this is something that is like a toolkit or a set of parts, a set of tools that you can use with whatever you have. Actually, I forgot to say another thing you can plug in. This is an amplifier, so this is actually a contact mic. So I might as well actually patch that in so you can hear it. So that there, if I turn it up, is a contact mic, and everything on the panel becomes active. Just like the microphony that I designed a few years ago, and the ears, which was the Musical Instruments version of that same thing. So the idea was to make something open, something that other people, or something that you can connect with equipment you already have. It's also open because part of the design, you've got the kind of row of patch cables along the middle. Actually, two people can play this at once. You can sit opposite somebody else as they play it, and you can both control it. So the idea was that it would be open and useful. It's kind of a simple, practical set of parts. So here you've got two oscillators. So that's one oscillator, that's another oscillator. Here you've got two filters. That's one filter, that's another filter. Here you've got two, I call them slopes. They're envelopes, but they also loop. So that can be an LFO. You can probably see that flashing up and down there. That changes the speed. It can go down or up and down or just up. and it's looping at the moment, or you can have a blip which just does it once. So that's a kind of momentary switch. Or you can put a pulse in there from an external machine, or you can set this up as a sequencer. And so these are kind of envelopes. So an obvious patch, which I can show you in a moment, would be taking an oscillator from here, running it through the filter, and opening the filter with that envelope, and you'll get a sort of pulse. At the end, you've got a mixer. This is a stereo. It's got two stereo channels here. So there's the volume and there's the pan, and two mono channels. And then there are two outputs here that are kind of modular level, which you could connect to other modular stuff, but they're also quite interesting to take those out and patch them back in so you can get feedback loops going. And two headphone outs and a big headphone sort of volume socket there. The whole thing is powered from USB, so there's USB cable on the back there, power going in there, but there's also barrel power, so you can put in sort of 15 to 25 volts of power from a mains adapter. The USB is USB power delivery, so it's the kind of USB that can send out 15 volts. So that's sort of a lot of modern kind of USB-C wall adapters, but it's also, you can get batteries that do that now. The very cheapest kind of battery banks won't do it, but a decent one that will cost maybe sort of 40, 50 pounds will give you the kind of power you need to power this. Other things, the only other thing I haven't immediately mentioned is this, which is voltages. What this works is it has 4 voltages out there. These are 4 voltages out, like I just said, and then 4 buttons. And essentially, the voltages change when you press the buttons. And there's also a knob here, and that makes all the voltages change together. So it's not random, there's no kind of randomization in it, but it's very unpredictable. So if you take this and patch these off to 4 or 5 different places around the system, and then press the button, everything will change. You press that button back, and it will go back to the way it was. So it was kind of trying to do what's the minimum viable keyboard, what's the smallest thing that's a bit like a keyboard. It's not tuned, it's not volt per octave, it's nothing like that, but it's a way of controlling things like that way. Also, you can just pick one and use that as a kind of offset if you want to control a couple of different things. So that's the basic setup. As I said, I designed this for that retreat in Cornwall. So I had a dozen people came down to a big house in Calamansac in Cornwall by the river. And some people were very experienced, had lots of modular background. Some people had never used or touched a modular before. And I think probably the most important and the most immediate thing when you're looking at this is a real proper modular synthesizer. It's not semi-modular. There's nothing patched. There's nothing patched sort of behind. Well, there's a few things patched behind the scenes, but very little. So if you plug in your audio output and you turn the volume up, nothing will happen. That mixer at the moment is plugged into nothing else, so you're not going to hear any sound. So on the first day of that retreat, the first thing I did was talked about this patch. So you turn the FM down. FM's is actually connected behind, and that will kind of cross modulate between the two. Turn the fine tune to the middle, turn the big control to the middle, take the sine wave, patch it into the first channel of the mixer, put the pan in the middle, turn the mixer up a bit, and then turn the volume up a bit. And you will get a pure sine wave. And so you now have 2 controls. You have volume here, and you can change that however you want with a big knob. You can have it very gently coming and going, or you can have it a bit faster, probably about as fast as I can get it. And then you've got pitch with this hand. You can go very low, you can go very high. For me, that cuts off. If you've got younger ears than me, you might still be able to hear that. So you have this kind of instrument now. And this is a kind of theremin-ish instrument. It's obviously quite simple, it's quite wobbly. And when I did that at the retreat, the people who were kind of experienced were like, oh, and straight away I can turn up the FM or I can get something different. But I said, let's not do that. And for an hour, we just spent time playing with this instrument as it is and recording. So everyone at the event had a way of recording. And they would say, let's spend a minute just with these two controls trying to make some kind of music. Music, obviously, in quite a broad sense. And actually gave everyone at the retreat, the night before, we had done these kind of drawings. I don't know what they look like. Oh, there you go. And I said, right, take one of these, prop it up in front of you, and then try and play that drawing with those two controls. And then after an hour, I come back and listen to it. And it was amazing. After an hour, people came back and they played back what they'd done. And it was obviously quite wobbly, generally. But it was interesting. Different people's recordings sound different. Some people had different ideas. One person said, I'm not interested in this volume. I'm just going to use this pitch. Then after doing that, we said, let's go away for another hour. And this time you can multi-track. And you can imagine there it became very interesting because some people did kind of layers of sort of chordal sound that would change. Other people did kind of pulsing layers of rhythms. You can imagine taking that and then layering over it different rhythms over the top. So the reason I'm still talking about this patch is because for me this is a kind of archetypal kind of electronic. This is a real electronic instrument. You can use it, you can compose with it, you can learn it. One of the things I found when I first did this was the first time I did it, it sounded kind of very weird and wobbly. But when I listened back to that, I thought actually there's kind of more here. I can do more with this. And when I did it again, I learned different techniques. I learned about doing kind of swoops like this, where you pan in, you fade in and fade out at the end. The big thing I learned was actually you don't need to have it on the whole time. So if you're recording, particularly if you're multi-tracking, you might have it most of the time off and just add these little elements as you're moving. So as a way of thinking about something like this, I found that simplicity of that single cable kind of instrument really interesting. That's obviously not the only way to do it. So let's do a slight, as I said, I showed you this just now, which is the FM. And these oscillators are very kind of simple, essentially a kind of 1970s design that I've taken and just made with kind of cheaper modern components. So it's a thing called an OTA, which is a particular chip, a couple of op amps, and a few transistors. And I think they're particularly good at FM. They work very well. They have this kind of almost sort of rubbery, kind of bouncy sort of sound that I really liked. That was what I wanted to do. They can be tuned to a volt per octave. So these inputs, the pitch inputs, are volt per octave. There's a little trimmer there, and there's instructions for how to calibrate that. You're probably not going to get like 9 octaves of beautiful, perfect pitch out of it, but you'll certainly get, 4 or 5 octaves, I would hope, and you can be playing that with a MIDI converter or with this as a MIDI converter, and you should be able to play something that's reasonably kind of precise and in tune with it. As I said, these are cross-modulated against each other. So that's the FM coming from this control. And then I can also turn this one up, which means that's modulating this one, and this one's modulating that one. And that's when you get these very chaotic things will occasionally lock in particular positions. And then the other way you can modulate these against each other, I'll turn that off again, is with the ring modulator. So this is right next to it. Here, the ring modulator is connected, that one's connected to that one's connected to that. And so the ring modulator, whereas the FM changes the frequencies, it's frequency modulation. So as this oscillator goes up and down, when it's connected to this one, this oscillator goes up and down, and vice versa. With this, it's not changing the frequency, it's changing the loudness. So if I turn this right down, you can hear that slowly pulsing in and out. It's that's what you call tremolo on a guitar, a tremolo pedal. And that in itself is kind of quite an interesting effect. And if you were to instead patch the square wave in, you get quite a different effect. You only hear the crossings. But as you move the pitch up, you get these kind of side bands. And that's kind of a nice sound like that, but one of the sounds that I think is really nice from this is if you use the ring mod on something from the external input. So let's just try that now. So there is a drum machine. You can just about hear what it's doing through a little speaker, but let's plug that in. So that's now going into the output. You should be able to hear it here. So there's a drum machine. So instead, what we'll do is patch it into the ring modulator. And here you get this kind of immediately kind of an interesting effect. And then another fairly obvious thing you might want to do with the drum machine is to start overdriving it. So this circuit here, this is the drive circuit. I'm really not enjoying that patch. So this overdrive circuit has two circuits in it for amplifying. So that one is essentially a microphonic. So it's an op amp. And then that version is essentially the Minimoog drive circuit, so it's a transistor. And with each of these, this is still going through the ring mod. And you might start then changing the pitch of this oscillator with an envelope. And then again, you add another layer of modulation. So now FMing that from here. And quite quickly it turns into complete chaos. Another thing to do with that drum loop would be to get rid of the ring mod, keep it going through this distortion, and then run it straight into a filter. So these two filters, again, are quite, they're designed, the humpback filter, designed by Philip Goulding of Godsbox, who designed that a few years ago, and they've been sold on Thonk. It's just a DIY filter that I really enjoy, so I asked them if I could use it. It's essentially, I think, quite a sort of old-fashioned 70s-ish filter. And let's see what we've got here. So if you start adding a bit of resonance, and again, of course, you can start then modulating that with the envelopes. And these two filters, again, are actually connected sort of around the back. So this is modelled on the old MS-20 idea. If you turn them both so you've got two outputs. I haven't explained this. You've got the low pass output, which we listened to before. But you've also got a high pass or band pass output. So that sounds like the high pass. And it can have a band pass there with a switch. And that output actually is connected to this input. So if you set this as a high pass and then this, you use the low pass. Let's just turn it off. Just take the distortion out, just cleaner. And we can have both of these moving with different MFOs to see them both bouncing around. As you can see, these filters are they're kind of clean, but they get quite not clean quite quickly, and you can use them as for sort of pinging, called pinging, when you have a filter that's resonant and you trigger it rather than sort of running really an audio signal through it. So if I take this one, so this is now, turn off the FM. A bit on the band pass. And if I now turn this right down, so it's really just clicking, and then gradually and very carefully turn up the resonance. here you start to get this kind of what you call pinging, I think. Let's just start. And this is where the stereo becomes quite fun. So if I do this again with another channel, so I just take exactly the same thing here, patched through, turn it up. Give it its own LFO. So the slopes can be used as an LFO, obviously. So this is a really kind of, obviously quite a sort of delicate patch. You need to get exactly the right frequencies and the right knob positions. Otherwise it just becomes this, which isn't really what you want. And if you FM these two, which are now clocks, against each other, you can get this kind of randomness. Now if you're like me, you might be thinking, well actually, what I really need there is a bit of reverb on that. So we can use a computer for that. You can see these cards. So there's a MIDI one, there's that one connects to the ATMU, which is why it looks like that. There is a Turing machine, and there is a reverb. So let's just take that, plug it in, and hit reset. That is now, this has now become a reverb. So what I'll do, patch this signal into one of the inputs, get a longer cable, patch this signal into the other inputs, then patch these out. One of the things you do find with this is obviously there's a lot of patch cables required. As I said, it is a real modular and you really are having to patch kind of all the time. So that is a very deep, on this is the way it's set up at the moment, is that's the mix and that's the amount of decay time. So let's see if we can get this a bit more. Change it to high pass, that kind of more delicate effect. So I think something like this, I like a patch like this because it's something that is kind of relatively easy, makes a lot of sense in modular world, because you think this is an oscillator but it's also a clock. But it's, and this is a filter, but it's also can be pinged, so it becomes like an oscillator. So it's a kind of reminder that when you are in modular worlds, the obvious thing isn't necessarily the first thing to do, and there are lots of different ways to do the same thing. So I think I'm going to leave it there. That, I don't know how long that has been, but that feels like quite a good place to start. I think that's about half an hour.